Each of us has examples before our eyes of how certain powerful groups, individuals and organizations exercise their influence and power in a hidden way, behind the scenes of visible events, which become just a screen for the trusting public. And of course, these forces wouldn't be able to pull something like this off if they existed chaotically. They must be organized. Security officials, power groups, government officials, and representatives of big business, all of them, when solving issues, don't look for the right ad on a veto, but talk face-to-face with the right people. In historical analysis, conspiracy theories are frowned upon. However, if history is devoid of conspiracy as a crucial factor, then events simply occur on their own, openly. So what should we do with statements like, "The world is run by occult forces and their secret society"? Or the fate of Europe? Is it really in the hands of just 300 people, each of whom knows all the others? They choose their successors from their own circle. These people have the means to put an end to any form of government they consider unjustified. The first phrase belongs to a representative of the British elite, Prime Minister of Great Britain, Benjamin Disraeli. The second belongs to a representative of the German elite, and at the same time an advisor to the Rothschilds, industrialist and foreign minister of the Weimar Republic, Walter Rathenau. In fact, the terms conspiracy theory, conspirology, and many similar phrases were introduced by the United States CIA as part of Operation Mockingbird, which began more than 70 years ago. Just think about that number. The goal of the operation was to establish CIA control over the media in America and beyond by creating an extensive network of agents in leading newspapers and news agencies around the world, as well as on radio and television. But people first learned about this program from the book by American journalist Deborah Davis, Catherine the Great, Katharine Graham, and her Washington Post empire. The book was published 40 years ago in 1979, and it was the first to mention the name of Operation Mockingbird. The book extensively covers Katharine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post, and her personal role in running the newspaper. The release of Deborah Davis's book was like a bomb going off. On orders from the highest levels, the publisher was told to stop selling the book and destroy it. Most of the 20,000-copy print run was destroyed, but some copies still reached readers. Deborah Davis was subjected to a smear campaign. Studies were published accusing the author of inaccuracies and mistakes. The project was mentioned again in 2007 when fragments of a CIA dossier, over 700 pages long, codenamed Family Jewels, were made public. Information about the project surfaced regularly. But why Mockingbird? It's simple. One of the methods involved neutralizing the activities of those journalists who did not align with the ideological guidelines of the Washington Committee. To do this, they resorted to discrediting and ridiculing undesirable individuals. Ridicule involved introducing new words into circulation and giving old words new shades of meaning. One of the most striking examples is the linguistic label conspirology, launched by the CIA. The word comes from the English word. In old dictionaries, its first meaning is secrecy. To discourage journalists and researchers from studying the activities of secret societies, the world backstage, and everything that the global elite tries to hide from the public eye in every possible way. They made conspiracy the first meaning of the word. They turned it into a stigma that is still used today against anyone who tries to tell people the truth about the world backstage. And despite the fact that officially intelligence agencies deny using such practices, experts are now convinced that Operation Mockingbird was never fully shut down. But what will skeptics say if they see the so-called proofs? Surprisingly, everything is happening openly, right before our eyes. The construction of a brave new world is described without any secrets in several sources. One of them is the book by Zbigniew Brzezinski, Technetronic Era, and it's also been half a century since its first publication. Brzezinski, born to a Polish-Jewish family in Warsaw, died in the United States. Actually, he was born in Kharkiv, where his parents were working at the Polish consulate at the time, and he was only registered in Warsaw. The peak of his political career was serving as National Security Advisor to the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. He is the author of many books, some of which have been translated into Russian. The book most familiar to Russian readers is his work, The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives. But it was actually Brzezinski's lesser-known Technetronic Era, that became the ideological foundation for the world's transition to a new state. This transition began at the turn of the 1960s and 1970s, when the era of industrial capitalism was coming to an end. The external manifestation of this was the emergence of crises. In the Bretton Woods monetary and financial system, which was based on the gold dollar standard, the masters of money were preparing for the paper dollar standard, for removing the gold brake from the Federal Reserve's printing press. This meant the world was entering the era of financial capitalism, a completely new world. Brzezinski understood this perfectly. He also understood that financial capitalism was not long-lasting, so he looked into a more distant post-capitalist future, building a super long-term action plan for the world elite. Zbigniew Brzezinski was a gray eminence in the Council on Foreign Relations, a regular participant in the annual meetings of the Bilderberg Club, and was closely connected with many prominent politicians, royalty, and major bankers. Brzezinski was especially close to David Rockefeller, who brought him into the public eye. At the initiative of this American billionaire, the Trilateral Commission was created in 1973, and Brzezinski was appointed its executive director. One of Rockefeller's actions was the creation of the Club of Rome. In 1968, Rockefeller asked Brzezinski to provide the Club of Rome with guidelines for its activities, and these guidelines were presented in the form of the book The Technetronic Era, almost simultaneously with Brzezinski's book, a book by the first president of the Club of Rome. The prominent Italian businessman Aurelio Pecci appeared, titled Before the Abyss. Brzezinski and Pecci spoke in unison about the coming cataclysms, expressing ideas on how to prevent them. This was a joint manifesto of the builders of a brave new world, in a slightly camouflaged form. It contained ideas that were later revealed in the reports of the Club of Rome, of which more than 50 have been prepared during the existence of this organization. Many of the reports, for greater credibility, contained models of long-term global development, calculated on the powerful computers of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In Brzezinski and Pecci, we will read about such global challenges as overpopulation of the planet, depletion of natural resources, declining agricultural productivity, environmental pollution, and climate change. And of course, to prevent them, it is necessary to restrain demographic growth, industrial development, and to consolidate efforts in the fight against the global environmental crisis under unified global leadership. Later, all these theses received a more radical revision. A sharp reduction of the planet's population to 1 billion people, deindustrialization, voluntary renunciation of national sovereignty by states for the sake of consolidating humanity, and the creation of a world government. Brzezinski was one of the most influential ideologists who began to justify globalization and the rejection of the industrial capitalism model. Together with American sociologist Daniel Bell, he promoted the post-industrial society. But he went further than Pecci and Bell. Brzezinski advocated for a technotronic society based on computers and communication technologies. As the ideologist of the digital society that gained prominence in the 2010s, Brzezinski speculated about the future technotronic society. When the first generation of computers appeared, working on vacuum tubes, just think about that fact, in the era of vacuum tube computers. In 1970, Brzezinski was already writing about a digital concentration camp, about how, in a few decades, the world would come to a technotronic era, a dictatorship in which almost all existing political procedures would be abolished. He talks about the masses as if they were inanimate objects, as objects of observation. In the technotronic era, a gradually, step-by-step, increasingly controlled society is formed. Such a society will be governed by elites who will not uphold traditional values. And soon it will become possible to monitor and control practically every citizen. It will become possible to collect even the most intimate information about every citizen and store it in special electronic files. And the authorities will then be able to directly use these files if necessary. And also, in the technotronic society, the trend will be toward merging millions of isolated and unconnected individuals into a single mass, which will be easily managed and guided by charismatic and likable personalities. These charismatic people will use the most advanced communication technologies to manage the masses, to direct people's emotions, and control their thinking. At first glance, it seems that Brzezinski was wrong about the charismatic and likable personalities. But who knows? Maybe in a couple of years, bloggers, actors, and other favorites of the undiscerning public will not just become so-called opinion leaders, but real political figures. Or here's another thing. At the same time, the possibilities for social and political control over the individual will increase. Soon it will become possible to exercise almost continuous surveillance over every citizen and to maintain constantly updated computer files. Files containing, in addition to the usual information, the most confidential details about each person's health and behavior. Half a century has passed, 50 years, and today, in the context of the so-called COVID-19 pandemic, we really see how vigorously the authorities of many countries are trying to create systems to monitor a person's physical condition, movements, contacts, and purchases. And Brzezinski also wrote about this. If we look ahead, there is the possibility of biochemical control over consciousness and genetic manipulation of people, including the creation of beings who will not only act, but also reason like humans. However, the architect of the New World Order became more cautious in his predictions near the end of his life. At the European Forum for New Ideas, which took place in Poland in 2012, he acknowledged the growth of global political activity among the broad masses of the population. It no longer allows them to be governed through externally imposed control, as was the case during the era of colonialism and imperialism. The unyielding and conviction-driven resistance of the people coming from the very depths of the nation is based on their political awakening and the rejection of external governance for historical reasons. This resistance is becoming increasingly difficult to suppress. The cunning old man bemoaned that in reality, things did not go as smoothly as planned in the book. And here's another thought to ponder. Everyone knows that in the political apparatus of every state, there are so-called secret or special services that are an integral part of it, and they deal exclusively with conspiracies, either creating them or counteracting them. The secret installation of Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba, the change of government in Afghanistan, the attempts by the United States to organize the removal of Castro, these historical facts can be called conspiracies. If you call them secret operations instead, does that really change much? After all, if in this context you replace the word conspiracy with geopolitics, many people will nod their heads respectfully. It turns out that all states, through their intelligence agencies, create and expose conspiracies. It's well known that intelligence agencies from various nations collaborate with one another to a certain degree. If intelligence agencies primarily engage in conspiracies, could collaboration between major intelligence agencies be considered a global conspiracy? Or here's another one. Just a few examples when the wildest conspiracies became historical reality once they were declassified. Well, for example, the attempt to control the human mind. From 1953 to 1964, at the CIA, they actually conducted experiments on people, setting ambitious goals to learn how to control human thoughts. Now, it sounds like the plot of a cheesy Hollywood thriller, but for the citizens of the United States who got caught up in it, it was no joke at all. During these inhumane experiments, people were given psychotropic substances and psychedelics without their knowledge, and the subjects were exposed to sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and hypnosis in attempts to gain control over their minds. It got to the point where they started experimenting with neuro-linguistic programming of individuals. The most disturbing aspect is that these experiments were conducted without people's knowledge, under the pretense of treating various ailments. The CIA's MK-Ultra program covered 86 major university centers in the United States, 12 hospitals, and even 3 prisons. The facilities were located all across the country, from sunny California to snowy Alaska. Some of the experiments were conducted on terminal cancer patients, assuring them that this was the latest method to fight their illness. Only 2 deaths of involuntary experiment participants have been officially confirmed. But it's not hard to guess that the United States authorities did everything they could to cover up their crimes against their own citizens. For instance, consider the Tuskegee experiment. It lasted from 1932 to 1972 and claimed the lives of at least 500 African Americans. The study aimed to determine if black people have higher tolerance for syphilis compared to white people. To do this, doctors deliberately infected 400 patients with syphilis, who, in the eyes of the authorities of the small town of Tuskegee, Alabama, were considered to have no value to society. Among them were the poorest residents of black ghettos, people who had problems with the law, and the unemployed. In 1947, medicine defeated syphilis, which could now be treated with penicillin, But the experiment in Tuskegee continued despite this. At the beginning of 1972, the details of this dirty project became public knowledge, and a scandal broke out. By that time, out of 400 test subjects, only 74 were still alive. In addition, it was established that the men infected by the scientists transmitted the disease to 40 wives and lovers, resulting in the birth of 19 children with congenital physical and mental disabilities. The private estate of American billionaire David Rockefeller in the picturesque Italian town of Bellagio. It was here, 55 years ago, in 1965, that a closed meeting brought together 24 intellectuals from different countries. They were writers and scientists. Later, this meeting was called the Conference on the Conditions of World Order. Apparently, the owner of the estate managed to convince the intellectuals that they could play a significant role in shaping the future world order. 3 years after this rehearsal, in 1968, an official meeting took place in Rome with the participation of 75 intellectuals, where the establishment of the Club of Rome was solemnly announced. All reference books and encyclopedias tell us the names of the two founding fathers of the Club of Rome, Alexander King and Aurelio Peccei. Peccei was the president of the club from 1969 to 1984, but when he died, King became the president. However, as is typical in such organizations, they were merely managers, ensuring that the true founder, David Rockefeller, remained in the shadows. The Club of Rome, which legitimized and promoted the pseudoscientific justification of Rockefeller's idea, was one of the main projects in this person's life. According to the founding documents of the Club of Rome, the number of members is exactly 100. These individuals set the club's main priorities, suggest new projects, and approve prepared reports. Club members seldom prepare the reports themselves, with few exceptions. They are created by external contractors based on orders paid for by the club. External contractors may be represented in the club as associate members, who do not have voting rights. In addition to full and associate members, there are also honorary members. Both full and honorary members are people who are quite well known and influential. In the latest lists of active and honorary members, there are such figures as, for example, Mikhail Gorbachev, former United States Vice President Albert Gore, owner Ted Turner, former NATO Secretary General Javier Solana, and former United Nations Secretary Kofi Annan, former United States President Bill Clinton, billionaire and founder. Bill Gates, financier and speculator George Soros, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, the grey eminence of American foreign policy Henry Kissinger, Belgian Prince Philippe, Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, former President of the European Commission Romano Prodi, and Jacques Delors. All these influential people are carriers and spreaders of a dangerous brain virus. The Club of Rome's ideas can be described precisely as such. Additionally, its 35 branches worldwide contribute to disseminating these concepts. To many, the Club of Rome seemed, and still seems, like a fairly open international organization engaged in forecasting socio-economic and demographic processes in the world. Like a kind of platform where eccentric intellectuals gather and discuss issues of the distant future. They say the Club of Rome is far from politics. It's purely a research organization. Another think tank, of which there are several thousand in the world. Almost all well-known think tanks are affiliated with certain countries. They develop recommendations for their governments. The Club of Rome is an international organization concerned with the fate of all humanity, without any national preferences. A couple of centuries ago, there was a priest named Thomas Malthus who darkened the skies. He warned that there wouldn't be enough food for everyone in England and that people would start dying. Therefore, it's better to prevent demographic growth, preferably by civilized means, for example, voluntary refusal to have children or forced sterilization. And if the reduction happens as a result of wars or some epidemics, that's even better. The spontaneous reduction of the population as a result of such cataclysms can also be considered a desirable form of demographic regulation. So, instead of learning to use natural resources wisely and renew them, we just need to destroy or sterilize people. The teachings of Father Malthus were ultimately called a sermon of genocide. The Club of Rome's reports are essentially similar sermons, only mildly concealed. The Club of Rome is an official body that issued official and completely public reports and statements, which were intended to legitimize, to refine and wrap in a scientific package the candies that were carefully prepared for humanity. In non-public organizations like the Bilderberg Club, Trilateral Commission, Tavistock Institute, and Committee of 300. In general, those very ones that have always acted covertly and deliberately made fun of hardcore conspiracy theorists. They sometimes created and spread fake conspiracy theories to keep the real facts hidden. One of the main tasks assigned to the club was to scientifically justify the policy of depopulating the Earth. In other words, the policy of global genocide. We'll talk about that a little later. And now about the club's second task, to scientifically justify the policy of deindustrialization. That is, the policy of destroying industry on a global scale. Well, supposedly, we need to save planet Earth, because the pace of industrial and demographic growth leads to the rapid depletion of natural resources and dangerously severe environmental pollution. In the reports of the Club of Rome, especially in the report The Limits to Growth, published half a century ago, in 1972, the concept of zero growth was formulated. That is, everything was presented completely openly and publicly. As the name of the concept suggests, the Club of Rome proposed to stop both demographic and industrial growth, to freeze the population size and the volume of industrial production at the level that existed at the beginning of the 70s. There was also an opinion that more radical action was needed, that zero growth wouldn't save us, and that a negative solution was necessary, meaning a reduction in both the population and the level of industrial development. Some members of the Club of Rome have proposed, and still propose, to limit the world's population to 1 billion. In the club's 50 years, they have yet to achieve zero growth rates, suggesting a lack of progress. In the past half-century, while Earth's population has doubled, the Club of Rome's accomplishments in industry are more significant. A post-industrial society can be defined as a society in which industry has been completely or partially eliminated from the economy, and the main part of the economy consists of various services. Among these services are medical and educational ones. But whereas previously they were provided mostly free of charge by the state, in a post-industrial society, they become paid services. In addition to these traditional social services, a large number of other services are added, which previously played a very modest role in industrial society. At the top of the list among such new services are financial ones: credit organizations, insurance companies, investment funds, and investment banks. Even traditional pension provision is becoming a branch of financial services, since pension funds are becoming private. The theoretical constructs of post-industrial society ideologists assign a significant role to various intermediary services, including financial services, which are a form of intermediation. But in addition to this, there are services in trade, advertising, real estate, and auditing businesses, rating assessments, brokerage services for placing securities issues on financial markets, and much more. In Zbigniew Brzezinski's Technetronic society, traditional sectors of heavy and manufacturing industries are also absent. There, the main focus is on activities that are now commonly referred to as the knowledge economy or information economy, which is based on the use of information and computer technologies. According to the Club of Rome, deindustrialization was meant to include the whole world, with no exceptions. No concessions were planned for the United States either, and the plans to dismantle American industry were wrapped in the elegant packaging of the post-industrial society theory. It was constantly suggested that it should become the world's first post-industrial society, where industry and agriculture would play a supporting role, and the main part of the economy would consist of various services. Before World War II, America was considered the world's leading industrial country. By 1970, America was already in a post-industrial society. The real economy sectors, mining and manufacturing, energy, agriculture, construction, and transportation, accounted for less than half, 44.3%, of gross domestic product, and services and trade accounted for 55.7%. In 2016, America became completely post-industrial. The real economy sectors accounted for 19.8%. While services and trade made up 80.2% of gross domestic product. Most Western nations are close to the United States in terms of deindustrialization. In France and the United Kingdom, industry accounts for less than 20% of gross domestic product, while in Japan, it's around 23%. The deindustrialization of many European countries was carried out under the slogan of building a common European home and integration. At the end of the 1980s and the 1990s, The bankers of Western Europe paved over the industry of Central Europe and the Baltics in the name of conserving resources. That's what the European Union was created for. Under the pretext of reforms and restructuring, deindustrialization occurred in Russia, post-Soviet countries, and former socialist nations. By the way, the founder and first president of the Club of Rome, Aurelio Peccei, always showed a heightened interest in the Soviet Union. However, his interest was quite specific. Once, Peccei spoke quite frankly, stating that the socialist countries needed to be opened up like a can with a sharp can opener. The role of this sharp can opener was played by projects from Peccei's native Fiat, which built the Avtovaz plant in Tolyatti and the Pepsi production plant. But you can learn more about this in another episode. The third strategic goal of the club was the elimination of the sovereignty of nation-states. This goal can be formulated differently: creating conditions for globalization. Globalization is the final phase in the strategic plan of the money masters to establish their power over the planet. And the main obstacle to globalization, economic, financial, informational, and cultural, is the sovereignty of nation-states, which protect their cultural and civilizational identity, their economy, their domestic market, their monetary system, and so on. All of this together makes up what is known as national interests. The very first reports of the Club of Rome introduced into scientific and political discourse such concepts as globalization, global problems, global society, and globalism. Of course, these terms had appeared before, even prior to World War I and even in the previous century, but they had very limited use. But starting from the 1970s, the word globalization became popular both among scholars and politicians, and later became commonplace in the media as well. In 1976, the Jamaican Monetary and Financial Conference took place, which effectively removed the gold brake from the United States Federal Reserve's printing press. It was at that time that the gold dollar standard was abolished. In this new situation, the masters of money needed room so that, with the help of the printing press's dollar output, they could buy up the entire planet. Globalization was necessary for that, but it's impossible without eliminating national sovereignty. The Club of Rome provided the theoretical foundation for this elimination. The theory was actually quite simple and consisted of three theses. One of the main threats to humanity is the ecological crisis, the ultimate destruction of the biosphere and the human habitat. In addition to extremely high pollution of the atmosphere and hydrosphere, humanity also faces the threat of heat death as a result of the so-called greenhouse effect. There are also other environmental threats, such as the thinning and destruction of the ozone layer, which protects humans from harsh radiation. Many flora and fauna species have disappeared, along with radiation emissions and food contamination by nitrates and toxic chemicals. Yes, there are countless global threats. You could come up with them endlessly. Humanity should mobilize all its resources to prevent an ecological catastrophe. This needs to be done both within individual countries, through national environmental protection programs, but preferably at the international level, by developing interstate cooperation in solving environmental problems. The planet's biosphere is unified and indivisible. Pollution of the atmosphere and hydrosphere knows no borders. Radiation and electronic emissions and pollution can also spread their effects far beyond national boundaries. A number of man-made disasters have shown that the radius of their destructive consequences can be measured in hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. Considering this, a country's development of productive forces is no longer solely its internal matter. From this follows an apparently natural and obvious conclusion. National sovereignty is not only a foolish, but also a dangerous relic. If the leaders of nation-states do not want to doom humanity to an environmental disaster, they must give up their sovereignty. To start, they should allow international missions to conduct environmental audits at businesses and other national economic facilities. The next step, competent international organizations will recommend, in the name of global environmental safety, that certain enterprises and facilities be shut down. And then they will dictate to countries what they should develop and what they should not. For example, in the energy sector, which seems most logical, but not only there. And all of this, of course, is in the name of humanity's interests. Over time, the reports of the Club of Rome identified other global problems besides environmental ones, such as energy and food issues. The Club of Rome tried and continues to try to convince all of humanity that solving energy and food problems, as well as the shortage of energy resources and food, is not only ineffective, but even impossible within the framework of individual countries. The concept of zero growth, originally proposed by the Club of Rome, was later replaced by the concept of organic growth. Its essence is that international experts advise, or even order, a country on what to produce and what not to produce, what to build and what not to build, what to extract and what not to extract, taking into account the interests of all humanity. In other words, nation-states should voluntarily give up their sovereignty for the sake of humanity. Of course, behind the interests of humanity are actually the interests of transnational banks and corporations owned by the masters of money. Why was it necessary to destroy education? Precisely to implement the first goal of the policy of depopulating the earth, the future world order, according to the Club of Rome, and translated into plain Russian. A society where the golden million will rule, and the dirty billion will serve them. It's clear that the representatives of the dirty billion shouldn't be reasoning and fully understanding people. It will consist of subhumans, biorobots, who will be easy to control. Technical education would become an anachronism in conditions where, according to the recommendations of the Club of Rome, there will be a course towards deindustrialization of the economy. One of the main members and the first president of the Club of Rome, Aurelio Peccei, in his book Human Qualities, written in 1977, questioned the reasons for the upcoming crisis of humanity. Additionally, he explored anthropology, rather than limiting himself to factors like population and industrial growth. And it seems quite logical that he came to the conclusion that the enemy of humanity turns out to be man himself. Accordingly, human nature needs to be remade. Peccei only voiced the general idea about the need to change human qualities. This idea was formulated into a program called Changing the Image of Man. The Center for the Study of Social Policy of the Charles Kettering Foundation at Stanford University conducted the project, led by the center's director, Willis Harman. The first drafts of the future program were made back in the early 70s. Not only the staff of the center participated in the preparation of the report called Changing Images of Man, which was carried out at the turn of the 70s and 80s. They were only responsible for compiling the parts into a single document. The main participants in the project were experts from the Tavistock Institute, which we have already talked about. Ervin Laszlo, a prominent Club of Rome member, author of their 1977 report, Goals for the Global Society, and founder of the Budapest Club, a Hungarian branch of the Club of Rome, also took part in the project. The project included participants from both the scientific community and intelligence agencies. For example, Sir Geoffrey Vickers, a high-ranking officer of the British intelligence agency Military Intelligence, H6C. His son-in-law, Sir Peter Vickers Hall, was a founding member of the so-called Conservative Heritage Foundation, which was closely connected in many ways to the Tavistock Institute and the Club of Rome. Margaret Mead, a Columbia University professor and renowned anthropologist, was another key figure in the project. Meanwhile, one of the main ideas of her anthropological research was the thesis that the family is not a natural institution of society. Rather, it is unnatural, and Margaret herself was in an informal relationship with another woman. The report, Changing the Image of Man, was submitted in January 1981 to the administration of President Ronald Reagan. Apparently, the recommendations contained in the report were adopted by the President's administration and the United States government, since America began to sharply decline in terms of human capital quality in the 1980s. Even a seemingly insignificant fact exists. Before that time, Hollywood actively promoted the model of a normal American family with parents and 2 or 3 children in comedies and films in general. But then this model began to be pushed into the background. The document was, of course, classified. Later, it was declassified and published as a book, which was called The Aquarian Conspiracy. The ideology of depopulation of our planet and deindustrialization of the world economy, which is laid out in the reports of the Club of Rome, is surprisingly combined with the ideology of economic liberalism. The ideology of economic liberalism tries to impose on people the idea that there is a magic wand called the market. But a real market implies competition, and also assumes that everything should be bought and sold, including that everything should be paid for. Education is one of the market services. The winner in the competitive struggle is the one who can reduce production costs for goods and services. The mouthpiece of the ideology of the Club of Rome, American economist and authority in the field of environmental economics, Tom Tittenberg introduced the concept of the price of a child, which is the sum of all costs for them up to the end of school. In his opinion, the price of a child should be managed, including by reducing the costs of education through lowering its duration and quality. For a post-industrial society, excessive quality education is an unnecessary and wasteful expense. As a result, the new generation of children became the first in history to be educated worse than the previous one. After all, the education system had always been improving before that. It's logical. Each new generation in a thriving society should be more educated than the last, as it builds upon the accumulated experience. This natural process was reversed. This is how the outstanding academic mathematician Vladimir Igorovich Arnold assessed the education crisis in the West.
Our education leaders declared that we need to make our education good, meaning like it is in America. What has it become like in America? Americans, on the other hand, explained to me that they are deliberately fighting to keep people poorly educated, uninterested in science, culture, or anything else. Because that goes against a consumer society. Because if people start getting interested in something other than washing machines and cars, which they have to buy new every week, then they become worse consumers. They start, and if they do buy something, they start buying Van Gogh or some poetry or proving theorems, and that's harmful for a consumer society, so that shouldn't happen. And besides, the population should be an obedient herd in the hands of manipulating politicians. We need to create not a European but an American education system where they don't teach anything. This is your program, which contains water vapor. This is done on purpose so that only the elite students of the 57th school in Moscow, who also end up with us, can handle it. And they know this. And our guys will never be able to understand your water vapor, which has no taste, no color, and no smell. This is inaccessible for our guys, so this is a racist program that requires water vapor. And this is what we're heading towards. This is what we're striving for. This is what they call a good education. They can't hire American-grown people, school children, students, university or technical college graduates to work for them, build new airplanes or repair old ones. Even Boeing survives only because they hire immigrants, mainly from 3 countries, Russia, China, and India. That's why they say, we read in your newspapers that you are planning to bring your education system up to American standards. And according to our calculations, in 30 years, Russia will have education just as bad. Then we won't have anyone at all. And then this whole technological system will collapse because it's based on immigrants.
I have to say that there was once a pretty good system of school and higher education in the United States. However, the education system had already started to decline before the Club of Rome was established with its harmful recommendations and prior to the onset of the globalization era. A serious wake-up call for America was the launch of the artificial Earth satellite by the Soviet Union on October 4, 1957. Arrogant America suddenly realized that it was lagging behind the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in terms of science and technology. Urgent hearings were held in the United States Congress to determine the reasons for such a lag. One of the main reasons cited was the inadequate level of education in the United States, especially in higher education, particularly in natural and technical sciences. Some measures were taken. In particular, budget funding for universities was increased. A certain positive effect was achieved. However, by 1970, its effect had been almost completely exhausted. Education in America then started evolving based on the Club of Rome's recommendations. Higher education gradually began adopting market principles. Everything mentioned above is directly related to Russia, which began to live according to the recommendations of the Club of Rome. In our country, over the past 3 decades, there has been an active process of destroying the education system, both at the school and university levels. The process began in the last years of the Soviet Union's existence. It is noteworthy that the main argument in favor of various destructive decisions was a reference to the experience of the United States. Is there really a connection between the Kopeka and the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? Let's figure it out. The emergence of Avtovaz in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is actually quite a murky story, with its nerves and roots going deep into the hidden processes of the decay of the Soviet elite and the formation of the anti-Soviet project, which culminated in Gorbachev's perestroika. Contacts with the Soviet elite under the guise of being with the Italian elite, but actually with the global elite, began back in the late 50s during Khrushchev's time. The Soviet leadership had long considered creating a giant auto factory with Western help. The French, competitors to the Italians in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, were favored by Khrushchev, who leaned towards supporting the French and their Renault factory. The agreement was almost reached. At the time, France, led by de Gaulle, was a sovereign nation, independent from the United States. An alliance between the Soviet Union and France posed a danger to the West. And then, right before the deal was about to be finalized, the management of Renault suddenly changed, and the new head demanded twice as much as had been previously agreed. Naturally, in that case, Fiat's offer turned out to be better, and they went back to them. The first road tests of the Fiat in the Krasnodar region on our roads showed that it was absolutely unsuitable for production in Russia. After 10,000 kilometers, the Fiat started falling apart. Cracks appeared in the body, and the suspension broke down. Our Volga-Gorkovsky Avtomobilny Zavod 21S were much sturdier, more capable, and better. With Soviet help, Italian engineers improved the Fiat's quality, allowing it to last up to 30,000 kilometers before falling apart. But the main thing was that the Italians gave a loan on favorable terms for the construction of the factory. After all, the top-down order to invade the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had to be executed at any cost. The alliance between Soviet and Western elites formed in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and they didn't require the project of developing Soviet socialism. They realized it was a long-term endeavor, not a quick fix, and they succeeded. In the Soviet Union, they began to abandon development, cut off funding for their own projects, and focus on the West. At the center of Soviet Union-West relations were the connections between the Soviet Party leadership and the Club of Rome. Ecology, demographics, technology, and progress served as means to legitimize contacts between Soviet and Western elites, providing topics that facilitated communication and brought them closer together. One of these topics was the involvement of Italian and the global structures behind them in the creation of an automobile plant in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That very same Péchet admitted to his friend, former United States Secretary of State Alexander Haig, that he felt like a reincarnated Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Bavarian Illuminati, a mystical Masonic sect based on Satanism. By that time, there was already quite a lot of talk in the West about how the world economy was divided in an extremely unproductive way. About a third of it was outside the market, in the so-called Soviet sector of the economy. The existence of the socialist bloc hindered capitalist expansion. This is exactly what Péchet meant when he said that the countries of the socialist bloc needed to be opened up like a can with a sharp can opener. Péchet made considerable efforts to involve Soviet leaders in market relations and personally contributed not only to the contract with Fabbrica Italiana Automobili Torino, but also with PepsiCo. It was quite simple, since for 30 years, Péchet, along with other positions, was the executive director of Fabbrica Italiana Automobili Torino Motor Company. The Mossad, the CIA, and the KGB closely cooperated with the Club of Rome. It's not surprising that this club had a special influence on the chief security officer Andropov and the army of his protégés. Andropov's protégé, G. Vishani, became an active party in lobbying for Italian interests within the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics leadership. You're likely hearing this surname for the first time. It was in the autumn of 1972. The unremarkable deputy head of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics State Committee for Science and Technology, German Gvishani, flew to Austria to meet with representatives of the Club of Rome at a castle near Vienna, and the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. At that time, this institute had just been established. Its founders included the United States of America Union of Soviet Socialist Republics Canada, Japan, West Germany, East Germany, and other European nations. International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis was secretly referred to as a joint KGB and CIA project, serving as a negotiation platform for elites from capitalist and socialist nations. 43-year-old Gvishani was exactly the person whom the Soviet Party elite entrusted with building bridges between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the West, and he was by no means a stranger to that very party elite. Gvishani was the son-in-law of Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, the second most powerful person in the country. Kosygin was friends with his father, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, Lieutenant General Mikhail Gvishani. They owed each other their lives. Gvishani saved Kosygin during the so-called Leningrad affair trials in the late 40s. In turn, Kosygin came to the aid of the elder Gvisiani when he was almost put on trial and executed, together with the deputy ministers of Lavrenti Beria in 1953. So, the year 1972. Gvisiani is holding secret talks with Club of Rome representatives in Vienna. If the subject of the negotiations became known to the general public, or even to staunch opponents of close contacts with the West in the Kremlin, like Mikhail Suslov, Gvisiani would simply have been shot for treason, because the negotiations were about nothing less than the upcoming collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. At first, two gentlemen, Petchy and Lord Zuckerman, took the floor and read something like a political briefing to Gvisiani. We already know about Petchy. But who is Lord Zuckerman? Well, here's a brief background. He was a scientist and chief scientific advisor to the British government. Initially specializing in primate anatomy and sociology, he later switched to studying Russians. He advised Churchill during the war. He developed the so-called transportation plan, according to which the British Air Force carried out bombings of Italian and German infrastructure. He worked on nuclear non-proliferation and global economic issues. He remained a consultant to the British Ministry of Defense, combining this work with his scientific activities. A separate special position was created for him, which was abolished after his death. And what did these two Western gentlemen tell Germain Gvisiani? Here's what. The population of the Slavic republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is not increasing, while in Central Asia it is growing like yeast. At the same time, it is Russia that provides the minimum subsistence for the Central Asian republics, allocating them colossal subsidies. In the Soviet Empire, unlike Western empires, the center fed the outskirts rather than the outskirts feeding the center. Petchy asked Gvisiani to show the Western proposal to Soviet leaders Kosygin, the prime minister, and Andropov, the KGB head. It boiled down to the following. By increasing subsidies to the outskirts, Russia is doomed to poverty. Meanwhile, modernization is stagnating and the technological gap is widening, while China prepares for a technological breakthrough. If Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus free themselves from the outskirts in the form of the Central Asian republics and manage to carry out rapid modernization, then the new union will find its place somewhere in the economic niche between the developed West and the developing China, in the so-called semi-periphery. If not, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics will inevitably come to an economic collapse. After Gvisiani held negotiations and returned to Moscow, he met with Andropov. It was decided not to rush things, but first to calculate all the risks and benefits that the division of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics could bring. It was clear that such a task required a platform, as well as specialists, economists, political scientists, and sociologists. In the end, MIPSA was not suitable for this. A research institute within the country was needed. It took 3.5 years to set up the platform. Scientists were chosen based on two factors. They had to be not too talkative and not sympathetic to the Soviet economic system. Ideally, they should have been secret anti-Soviets. They couldn't be openly anti-Soviet, because they probably wouldn't have been able to remain free for long. And so, in the summer of 1976, the All-Union Scientific Research Institute for System Studies began operating at NIISI as the Soviet branch of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. The first director of the institute was none other than German Gvisiani, and he held this position for 17 years. During this period, Gvisiani was elected to the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Socialist Republic, the Club of Rome, and received honorary doctorates from the Prague University of Economics and the Helsinki School of Economics. He also became an honorary member of the Swedish Royal Academy of Engineering Sciences, the Finnish Academy of Technical Sciences, the American Academy of Management, and the International Academy of Management. And he received almost all of these and dozens of other honors while remaining a Soviet citizen, a modest and little-known scholar. It took several years to develop the idea of the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in detail. Only in December 1982, after Andropov became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Central Committee and the de facto leader of the Soviet state, were the developments of Gvisiani's subordinates systematized. All that remained was to present them to the Politburo and thus make the final political decision. A so-called Tikhonov-Ryzhkov Commission was created in the Politburo to prepare a large-scale economic reform in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was actually political, and put an end to the Soviet Union as it functioned at that time. Zarman Gvishiani provided scientific leadership for this commission, assisted by Institute staff Stanislav Shatalin, Yegor Gaider, and Petr Avin. The Tikhonov-Ryzhkov Commission produced a 120-page economic reform program for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Hungary was used as a model. The formation of a new union, which involved signing a new union treaty between the republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was stipulated in the appendix to the program. But it's not a fact that the treaty would have been signed with everyone. Only Azerbaijan, the Baltic states, and Slavic republics may have joined the new union. And then suddenly, Andropov dies. And his successor, Konstantin Chernenko, has no desire at all to reform the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In short, the document was shelved. It was only taken out in the summer of 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev became the head of the country. And now, taking all of the above into account, let's go back to Avtovaz. The factory, of course, is not to blame. The people working there are not to blame. The cars that became the dream of the ordinary Soviet person are not to blame. And the builders of the factory are not to blame. They were sure they were building a bright future. No one knew what was really happening at that time. But what is happening now is visible to the naked eye. Avtovaz is now under Franco-Japanese control, signifying France's retribution. Foreigners are creating Ladas in Russia, but they do it in such a way as to reliably block the brand's prospects for global leadership and prevent the advanced development of Russia's own production. Russia's technological backwardness has been firmly preserved. Screwdriver assembly of foreign designs and the limits of Russia's current technical capabilities have become a source of pride for today's liberal elite in Russia. The Club of Rome did not work in vain. Avtovaz Z became one of the Trojan horses used to destroy the Soviet Troy, a channel for those who would become the architects of today's Russian elite to penetrate the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Yet, they all spoke to the people only of good things. Patriotism, the value of working for the motherland, sovereignty, and pride in the country. We believed them then, and many still do now. Look at this sweet old lady. This is Queen Elizabeth. She will soon be 95. Why has her appearance hardly changed over the last 20 or 30 years? The internet is full of funny pictures and memes about this, but it's not funny at all. Let's figure it out. In the center of London, there is a monument to the soldiers and officers who died in the Crimean War, especially to the sons of sirs and peers, who gave their young lives in the distant year of 1854. During the heroic and senseless charge of the Light Brigade on the Russian-held redoubts near Balaclava. Why did noble English youths come to the walls of Sevastopol? That's a topic for another time. The fact itself is what matters now. If the ruling class sent their country's soldiers to fight in foreign, distant lands, then in the front lines of the most dangerous attacks were their own children from the highest ranks. This was called aristocracy. One of the qualities of people from this class was that there was always something more important to them than the fear of death. In the 19th century, a person could not be considered a baron, count, duke, or lord if he was afraid of some kind of death. If he did not seek death in battle, he did not rush toward it as if to a beautiful bride. And now, let's return to our days. Not so long ago, the Queen of England granted the title of Baron to the son of a Russian banker, Baron Sibirsky. This title was given by the Queen of Great Britain to the son of the former Russian banker, Lebedev Evgeny. He became a life peer and received the right to sit in the House of Lords of the British Parliament. Very interesting. But would the banker father have sent his son to some modern equivalent of the Crimean War? Who would he fight for, the Russians or the English? Actually, it's not that important who he would fight for. We know for sure that he's not planning to risk his life under fire. This picture is completely unrealistic, because the elites are completely different now, and England has transformed into the North American states. And they don't send the heirs of great fortunes and successors of governors and presidents' dynasties to their deaths. Even the middle class is hesitant about war, yet America is always in conflict somewhere. However, almost all army positions are filled by people from poor neighborhoods, while the rich simply live, and live suspiciously long lives. Do you remember that ancient United States President, Jimmy Carter? He appears to have been a contemporary of the Egyptian pharaohs, occurring in a different era. Well, he's still alive. He'll be 100 soon, but for now, he's 90-something. And a bunch of other former presidents, senators, just rich people, they're all alive. But what's the secret of these long livers? What's different about them? Let's go step by step, so that the shocking facts at the end of the video don't sound like conspiracy theories, but have solid evidence. To begin with, let's compare our Baron Siberski with someone else. Recently, a young Baron Rothschild died in Switzerland. That's exactly how they put it. Young. He was only 57. Unbelievable. The official cause of death is a heart attack, but no one believes it. A commoner might die of a heart attack at 57, but the Rothschilds don't die of heart attacks at 57. They recall that the Baron had conflicts in business. John Rockefeller died at the respectable age of 97, and David Rockefeller at 102. Heart attack. It's not even funny. Our friends, relatives, acquaintances die, writers die, artists die, actors and television hosts die, everyone dies. In the past year, 2020 death claimed an especially large harvest. According to the laws of statistics, American presidents, oligarchs, bankers, and other masters of the planet should also die, especially considering the high number of elderly among them. How many have passed away? The COVID-19 pandemic has been raging for the second year, and it has brought death to many. Both famous people, influential people, and wealthy people have passed away, but not the most influential, not the wealthiest. It feels like there is a thick line separating people, even if they are successful, from non-humans, and this line is somehow connected to longevity. Today, almost everything in the human body can be replaced, except for the brain, which wears out at around 95 years old. Transplanting someone else's brain into yourself is pointless because it would no longer be you. One of the solutions, it seems, has been found in digitalization. Despite claiming to help the poor by connecting essential facilities like schools, medical stations, and government agencies to the internet, billions in investments are now being poured into the development of a neurocomputer interface system that unites the brain and the computer. In Russia, this project is called Neuronet, and it is overseen by the National Technology Initiative, whose roadmap openly lists goals such as life extension and personalized medicine. Could this be the first step toward eternal digital brains for those chosen few who have earned immortality by virtue of their wealth from birth? A very vivid illustration of such a strange future is the series Altered Carbon, in which the MAFs are practically demigods. They can buy any body they want, clone their own, create dozens of their own clones, or even back up their consciousness onto a reserve stack. This is a world where it became possible to upload human consciousness and personality from one body or shell to another using a stack. And even though this is still science fiction for now, even today we're talking about a fundamentally different level of medicine, where accidental sudden death is almost eliminated. But this level of medicine is available to very, very few people. And of course, it's not just because of the high cost, but also because some methods are deliberately used only within a narrow circle. Of course, some of the elite technologies do make their way into the public sphere. For example, here's a medical startup that plans to fight aging by transfusing blood plasma from young people into elderly patients. The basis for this is experiments on parabiosis, that is, joining two mice together and transfusing blood from young individuals to older rodents. In both cases, the old mice started to feel better. Experiments have already been conducted on humans as well. Of course, it sounds more like some kind of bad joke in the style of Count Dracula, but such things go deep into history. In the 1930s, a doctor named Paul Nihans appeared in Switzerland. He bought a mansion in the Swiss Alps and named it Sun Rock. And after some time, he was already naming among his patients the richest and most powerful people in the world, among whom shone the names of Pope Pius, Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, Konrad Adenauer, Somerset Maugham, and Bernard Baruch. At the same time, Paul Nihans was essentially not a certified doctor. His origins are unclear. He himself claimed that his mother was the illegitimate daughter of the Prussian King Friedrich. So, what was the method of his treatment that made old people rejuvenate both externally and internally? And it's not so much about the number of years, because Churchill lived to 96, Thomas Mann to 80, Pope Pius to 82, Somerset Maugham to 91, Bernard Baruch to 95. Nichans himself died in 1971 at the age of 89. That's a lot, but no one made it past 100. But something else is important here. All these people led active intellectual and physical lives until their deaths and did not experience the infirmities of old age, such as, for example, sexual impotence. So, the method itself was simple. Vital organs were extracted from sheep or cow embryos and administered to the patient in the form of medicine. Nichans charged $1,500 for each rejuvenating injection, and by the end of his life became fabulously wealthy. However, treating elderly millionaires with cow and sheep embryos turned out to be just a prelude. Soon, doctors mastered an incomparably more effective medicine, which was made from embryos that were, let's say, not from animals. And this is a very expensive medicine. 1/5,000th of a gram costs about $2 million United States dollars. The topic of this drug is very complicated, and it could be discussed in a separate episode, but not on YouTube, only on Telegram. Let me know on Telegram if it's worth preparing material about this. Your reaction will be the deciding factor. In the meantime, let's see how they back up the obvious difference in longevity with scientific evidence. How could they do without it? Scientists publish studies showing that smart and wealthy people live longer than the poor and less intelligent. Intelligence, and the interesting, well-paid jobs associated with it, of course, help a person lead a healthy lifestyle. But that's true for any normal person. It's obvious that here, the scientists have clearly confused cause and effect. Just like, for example, sociologist Linda Gottfredson from the University of Delaware and psychologist Ian Deary from the University of Edinburgh did. Yes, we published several studies proving that rich people live longer because they are initially smarter. That is, they were deliberately justifying social inequality by the genetic superiority of the ruling class. Every cricket should know its own hearth. But the poor don't study at prestigious colleges because of their natural stupidity, but because they don't have money for education. That's all. It's enough to remember how the children of workers and collective farmers, after receiving a decent education and becoming adult specialists, phenomenally advanced science in the Soviet Union. Or is it only here, right? Korolyov, the son of teachers, was the author of the Soviet space program and the author of the American space program. Werner von Braun, designer of the Third Reich, royal blood, a baron for several generations. His father was a minister, chairman of the Reichsbank, and deputy Reich Chancellor. We discussed this in this episode. What do you think? Do the rich really live longer because they are smarter? The long-abandoned ghost town of Ladlow in southern Colorado was the site of bloody events more than 100 years ago, and it is very instructive to take a closer look at this story. At the beginning of the 20th century, the entire town of Ladlow belonged to John Rockefeller Jr. and his company, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, that is, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company of Rockefeller. The son received the company from his father as a birthday present. Thousands of coal miners, including children, worked for pennies, most of which ended up back in the Rockefellers' safes. Their families crowded into company-built barracks and bought groceries at its stores. Many of them were recent immigrants, mostly Greeks and Italians. Working in the mines was hellish, and the miners' mortality rate was very high. Accidents with many casualties often occurred in the vicinity of Ludlow. For example, an explosion at the Primero mine in January 1910 claimed the lives of 75 miners, and in October of the same year, 56 people died at the Starkville mine. There was no labor protection at the Rockefeller mines, and the state government was almost completely under their control. Not only were all the workers, including migrants, registered as voters, but, believe it or not, even the company's donkeys were registered. Although, of course, that's not true. There were no donkey voters, there were mule voters. That is, hybrids of a donkey and a mare, more resilient and less demanding for heavy mining work. People and animals voted as instructed by their owners, with their votes recorded in the desired column. The Rockefellers were supporters of managerial capitalism, meaning they left all decisions to the managers, who were required to achieve maximum profit at any cost. This led to a lot of abuses. miners and their families were essentially kept in a state of slavery. In September 1913, about 10,000 miners went on strike, demanding workplace safety and higher wages. The protest was led by representatives of the Miners' Union, which was promoted by the famous activist Mary Jones, known as Mother Jones. Mary Jones's family came to the United States from Ireland, fleeing from famine. During a United States epidemic, she lost her miner husband and 3 children. When she was already over 70, she organized a march of workers' children from Pennsylvania to New York and led them right to the home of then-President Theodore Roosevelt. The slogan said, "We want to go to school, not to the mine." By the time of the Ludlow strike, Mother Jones was already 83 years old, but she hadn't lost her spirit. She came to the miners and inspired them to take action, for which she was once again sent to jail. A fairly popular leftist United States magazine is still named after her today. As soon as the strike began, the company managers immediately threw the workers' families out onto the street in the pouring rain. The union gave them tents, and whole tent cities sprang up around Ludlow and the neighboring mining towns, with the largest one housing about 1,200 workers. The company had a private armed force at its disposal, and additional fighters were hired. The Rockefellers rightly believed that the state authorities were at their service, and they requested the National Guard, which also sided with the owners. The guards terrorized the population, but the National Guard turned a blind eye to it. However, they did not allow the strikers to stop the strikebreakers hired by the company. The strike dragged on for many months, but on April 19, 1914, the climax came. The National Guard surrounded the strikers' tent camp, and a machine gun was set up on the nearest cliff. The authorities demanded that the miners hand over one of the ringleaders, but they refused, and the National Guard opened fire on the camp. Several miners' leaders were killed. Many of the strikers fled and hid in the surrounding area, and their families took shelter in cellars that had been dug under the tents back in the fall. In the evening, the National Guardsmen poured kerosene on the empty tents and set them on fire. As a result, many children and women died from burns or smoke inhalation. When they learned about what had happened, the miners attacked the city, assaulted officials, strikebreakers, and company managers, and seized the mines and an area covering 250 square miles. News of the uprising reached the newspapers mainly thanks to Mama Jones and other union members, and President Woodrow Wilson sent the army to Ludlow. The troops separated the strikebreakers from the strikers, but the strike continued almost until the end. In 1914, the workers achieved almost nothing, but several thousand new members joined the Union. The First World War began, and with it came the growth of American industry, which needed coal. In 1915, John Rockefeller met with Mother Jones, and working conditions in the mines began to improve. But after the whole country started talking about the Ludlow massacre, the Rockefeller family did something else. They hired 2 sharp public relations experts, Ivy Lee and Mackenzie King, to somehow strengthen their suddenly shaken image. In fact, Ivy Lee founded modern public relations, and Mackenzie King later became the Prime Minister of Canada. Lee convinced John Rockefeller Jr. to go to Colorado, meet with the miners, their wives and children, inspect the working and living conditions, talk to ordinary people, and listen to all their complaints. All this time, a photographer followed Rockefeller. Press releases about his interactions with the people started appearing in newspapers, and the billionaire appeared to society in a more humane light. Since then, the Rockefellers realized the importance of at least appearing, if not being, and that good public relations is just as important for running a big business as the ability to squeeze everything out of your workers. Squeezing out competitors or dealing with politicians. A bourgeois state's army may save you briefly, but you can't rely on bayonets to maintain power for long. One of the consequences of the Ludlow massacre was a sudden surge of interest, not only from the Rockefellers, but also from other American billionaire families, in everything that could provide positive headlines in the newspapers. Supporting the arts and education always provided excellent publicity. After all, what could be better than business leaders caring about your children's future and high moral standards? This approach can now be called old school because the world has changed, and tech entrepreneurs are less and less eager to appear kind. If good public relations is of any interest to them, it's only in countries where they accumulate profit and pay taxes, and the rest of the world can go to hell. You can, like Bill Gates, get involved in charity work in the third world, but only as long as it brings good headlines in the New York Times. And in any case, you need to know exactly what specific profit your investment in charity will bring. After all, every dollar spent on poor children in Zimbabwe has to work and bring back 1,000. For example, investments in the World Health Organization should turn into $1 trillion vaccination market. The story of the Ludlow massacre continues to this day. Jeff Bezos, like Rockefeller 100 years ago, came up with an even more cunning scheme. After all, Amazon uses a sweatshop system in its warehouses, where workers are paid minimum wage. They are under constant surveillance and are mercilessly fined for any infraction, such as taking an unscheduled bathroom break. So many employees work like COVID doctors, wearing diapers. Logistics have been automated to the point where any person who can be replaced by a machine has been replaced, and those who haven't been replaced have themselves been turned into machines. The work that Amazon employees do is monotonous. Offers absolutely no prospects for their personal development. It's just that robots still can't place items as precisely, and they're more expensive to maintain than people. But as soon as that changes, a person will be instantly replaced by a machine. Moreover, in 2020, Amazon's profit growth against the backdrop of thousands of small businesses going bankrupt across the country and the overall sharp decline of the United States economy began to be seen as a feast during a plague. All of this required a non-trivial move, and the public relations people came up with something for Amazon that Rockefeller could only envy. They suggested that Bezos use the company's own employees to create a positive image for the company. They were supposed to use Twitter and other social networks for this, but primarily Twitter. The shorter, the better. Short messages are easier to remember. Employees were supposed to write something like workers' letters about how well they work at the warehouse, how wonderful their colleagues are, and how good life is overall, and how good it is to live. First of all, people are more likely to believe these kinds of stories than posts from highly paid blogger influencers whose job is to promote new products. Secondly, these posts will reach exactly those they are intended for: ordinary people, among whom there are many future Amazon employees. After all, if current trends continue and small and medium-sized businesses finally go under, everyone will end up working in Amazon warehouses sooner or later. And finally, it's much cheaper. Not only is it cheaper than giving students charitable scholarships or scientists grants, it's even cheaper than maintaining a team of bloggers. After all, you can simply announce a contest among Amazon employees for the best tweet about their magical life and send the winner on a week-long vacation to the Caribbean or Disneyland. And the other participants can be offered work bonuses, a spot in the warehouse closer to home, an extra bathroom break, permission to talk at the workplace. Thousands of employees join the project and become ambassadors of the Self-Realization Center. They are given a free soft sprinkler for media professionals, which allows ordinary warehouse workers to easily manage their posts and see the results. The public relations specialists' calculations proved to be brilliant. The teams of ambassadors started actively posting on Twitter about how well the work was going. As soon as Sprinkler notified them that someone was discussing the sweatshop working conditions in the company's warehouses, writing about the persecution of union members and the firing of activists. Whenever anyone posted anything negative about Amazon, one of the ambassadors would immediately write in the relevant chat, "Guys, you're discussing how bad it is to work at Amazon, but I work at this company myself. Let me tell you firsthand, and I'll even send you some photos." One of the female ambassadors, named Kana, wrote a post in the thread where a negative article about the company was being discussed. The post immediately went viral. It started like this: "I also suffer from depression, and there was a moment when I wanted to quit Amazon. But then I realized that it wasn't about Amazon. It was about me. I'm allowed to talk to people, but sometimes I just don't want to. Now I have wonderful co-workers, and it's so great to spend night shifts with them." As a result of the Twitter campaign, according to social surveys, the level of trust in the campaign rose so much that it surpassed trust in the local police, elected officials, and even the church. Other companies immediately adopted this experience and started teaching their employees how to write proper posts about their wonderful workplace. There was even a term coined for those involved in this activity: employee advocates. And public relations specialists consider this kind of activity the best alternative to highly paid blogger influencers. Do Amazon employees have an opinion on this topic? The company's management is no more interested in their opinion than in the opinion of the mules in Colorado that the Rockefellers used to register for local elections. If employees are currently asked for their consent to participate in such activities, and in some places may even be paid for it, then in the near future, projecting a positive image of the company through personal social media accounts will be considered part of their job responsibilities. If a miner 100 years ago finished his shift in the mine, and after that his life didn't interest the employer, except maybe to make some extra profit by selling him soap or rope from the company store, now the worker belongs to the owner, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Not only the body is exploited, but also the soul, or rather, the cognitive part of a person, since his owners don't believe in any soul. It turns out that the Ludlow massacre is not only an example of how the owners behaved when they didn't consider the workers to be people, it's also a forecast for the future. An example of how they will inevitably behave again when people are once more regarded as animals. When not only philosophers and scientists, but also ordinary people reject the concept of free will, consciousness, and even the very idea of a human being. But the outcome of this battle, strangely enough, depends on each of us as well. It's worth considering these questions. That's a start. Imagine a planet where a handful of super-rich people have taken control of most of the economic and social infrastructure on a global scale. They have taken over objects of so-called intellectual property and seized most of the Earth's natural resources. She wouldn't mind privatizing the entire universe, but unfortunately, she didn't possess the technology for space exploration. One of the intellectual officers serving this group, Klaus Schwab, described the upcoming events on this planet as gently as possible in his book, The Great Reset. And one of the stages in all of this was the privatization of nature. Let's take a look at how it happened. In a publication at the end of 2021, an article like this appeared. Global megacorporations are starting to seize agricultural land in America to stop food production under the guise of fighting climate change. We're talking about companies that will start providing ecosystem services. Ecosystems are natural factories that absorb carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, process dirty wastewater, and produce oxygen and clean drinking water as a result. In addition, they preserve biodiversity, the genetic codes of millions of species of animals and plants. These genetic codes will be very much needed in the near future by the super-rich to solve their problems in the fields of biotechnology and genetic engineering. Amid sweet talk that ownerless property, or property in the hands of irresponsible entities, creates risks of ecosystem destruction. New types of economic entities are being created, which must be validated by nothing other than the stock exchange. Such entities have been named natural asset companies, or natural asset company, natural asset company. They are supposed to become commercial structures and make a profit by selling ecosystem goods and services, such as greenhouse gas absorption, oxygen, and clean water. As for the gene pool located in the privatized ecosystem, biotechnology and other companies can use it by acquiring a license for the relevant intellectual property. But the owners of genetic and other information related to the flora and fauna of wildlife can only be the people themselves. All others are simply users, and on a paid basis at that. Imagine a planet where listening to a bird in the forest would only be possible with a subscription to something like Amazon Nature. The New York Stock Exchange website already has a page dedicated to natural asset companies. Let's read. An AC will reflect the intrinsic and productive value of nature and provide savings instruments based on life, on important assets that underlie our entire economy and make life on Earth possible. Examples of natural assets that could benefit from the structure include natural landscapes such as forests, wetlands, and coral reefs, as well as working lands like farms. On this same website, it has already been calculated that the commercial potential of natural assets is $125 trillion per year, in the form of global ecosystem goods and services, such as carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and clean water. Compare this figure to the fact that all the oil and gas in the world were sold for only $4.6 trillion in total by the end of 2020. Methods for measuring environmental indicators and converting them into monetary value have already been developed. Among them are things like the sale of ecosystem services and natural capital. These indicators will complement companies' traditional performance indicators. In the fourth quarter of 2021, the New York Stock Exchange prepared listing standards and accounting information for and submitted them to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. It is expected that at the beginning of 2022, will approve the submitted documents, and in 2022, the first ones will be listed on the exchange. Everything starts with acquiring land that has the potential to generate ecosystem services. A sustainable enterprise that holds the rights to ecosystem services produced by natural, working, or hybrid lands. Natural lands are those untouched by human economic or other activities. Working lands are those that are currently being actively used. These are mostly agricultural lands. They can be repurposed from producing agricultural products to providing ecosystem services. Hybrid lands are those that contain areas of both the first and second types. A number of billionaires have already started buying up land, beginning to accumulate natural capital and convert their virtual financial assets into physical assets, land. In the United States, Bill Gates is most often named as the main land buyer, being the largest owner of agricultural land in America. In total, Gates owns about 242,000 acres across the United States. That's just under 100,000 hectares. However, Gates is not the largest landowner in the United States. The first place among billionaires who specialize in buying up natural land belongs to media magnate John Malone. 2.2 million acres of ranches and forests. In second place is the founder, Ted Turner, 2 million acres, mostly wilderness. The founder, Jeff Bezos, is rapidly increasing his investments in land. These money bags with famous last names are visible, but the crucial things are always done secretly. After all, one of the initiators of this whole idea of selling nature on the stock exchange is none other than the Rockefeller Foundation. Among other investors turning nature into a stock market asset is also the Inter-American Development Bank, with which the Rockefeller Foundation is working on creating digital currencies, central banks, and biometric digital identifiers. Of course, the Rockefeller Foundation does not openly advertise its interest in this process. Turning nature into a commodity is all wrapped up in words like sustainable development, nature conservation, and environmental well-being. The Rockefeller clan has been practicing all these specific operations for quite a long time. Since the days of Standard Oil, they have learned to carefully but effectively plan and implement their strategies. More than a century ago, in 1911, the court declared John Rockefeller's Standard Oil a monopoly, and the company had to split up. Despite this, it continued to control prices, and the company's subsidiaries still lead the oil market to this day. After the breakup, the government allowed Standard Oil shareholders to receive a share of stock in all 34 companies. This meant that each of the companies had shareholder owners who were supposed to compete with each other. But in fact, there was little incentive to do so, and the shareholders acted together, continuing to influence oil pricing. Their activities after the split were hardly monitored. This was facilitated by Rockefeller's influence on United States Presidents William Taft and Thomas Wilson. Rockefeller's fortune, who owned a quarter of each of the 34 new companies in 1913, was estimated at $900 million. He was the richest man in the world. And now let's go back 100 years forward and quote these eloquent lines from the Rockefeller Foundation's report. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world increased their powers and imposed the strictest rules and restrictions. From mandatory face mask wearing to temperature checks at the entrances of public places like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic was over, this more authoritarian control and surveillance of citizens and their activities remained and even intensified. To protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics and transnational terrorism, to environmental crises and rising poverty, leaders around the world began to govern more strictly. These are words from a 2010 report called Scenario for the Future of Technology and International Development, which was prepared by the Rockefeller Foundation. Some people, not without reason, believe that this is not just an accurate prediction of the future, but actually a project that took a whole decade to prepare. And in 2020, it was finally launched. But what kind of reports is the Rockefeller Foundation releasing now, these days? In late April and early May, the Rockefeller Foundation released a report. It's all about an action plan for financing vaccination and sustainable growth. In June, another report followed, an updated action plan for global vaccination. All these reports stir up panic, claiming that to save humanity, universal vaccination is necessary, covering at least 80% of the planet's population. It is stated that the majority of humanity lives in countries with such low levels of well-being that people do not have the opportunity to get vaccinated. There are no funds. There is an appeal addressed to the leaders of wealthy Western countries and international financial organizations to find the money and provide assistance to billions of the underprivileged so that they can get vaccinated. But what is behind the Rockefeller Foundation's interest in universal vaccination? There are two main reasons. The first is money. Robert Kennedy is the nephew of John Kennedy, the United States president assassinated in 1963. In his article, he writes that the main initiators and organizers of the ongoing Great Reset can be considered to be the Rockefeller and George Soros organizations. Robert Kennedy writes about a cartel comprising Big Oil, King Coal, and Big Pharma that has taken over America, the titans of the cartel of deception and authoritarian control of the deep state. In its most audacious, ruthless betrayal, this cartel has provoked a suicide for humanity and our planet. Their business plan poses a real threat to humanity, writes Robert Kennedy. The Rockefellers are present in each of the three components of the cartel. John Rockefeller Jr. managed to destroy traditional pharmaceuticals, which were based on natural products, replacing them with petrochemical products. He carried out this revolution in pharmaceuticals thanks to his cooperation with the Third Reich, specifically with the corporation. In the end, Rockefeller acquired a controlling stake, which later turned into a German chemical and pharmaceutical conglomerate. Concludes Robert Kennedy. Thus, today, the Rockefeller empire, in tandem with John Pierpont Morgan Chase, continues to own half of the pharmaceutical industry in the United States. The second reason is control. The Rockefeller family has supported controlling population growth for nearly a century. David Rockefeller Sr. became the founder of the Club of Rome in the late 1960s, which was intended to scientifically justify the need to restrain population growth and then gradually reduce the population. The reports of the Club of Rome determined that the optimal population of the planet is 1 billion. All the rest are considered surplus. And even before the Club of Rome, starting with Lakhmatov in 1903, the foundation provided financial support to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in its research on anthropology, human heredity, and eugenics. In the Third Reich, they moved from academic research on eugenics to practical experiments on people. The Rockefeller Foundation financed racial research even after it became clear that it was being used to prepare for the extermination of Jews, Roma, Slavs, and other so-called inferior Untermenschen. The Rockefellers' support for eugenic research continued even after the Third Reich adopted the Nuremberg racial laws of 1935, condemned by the League of Nations. But maybe all this isn't about the Rockefeller Foundation. It's just a charitable organization that does good, cares about the health of every person on Earth, and the poorer someone is, the more care they receive. And everything you've just seen isn't even about our planet, but about some other one. Write in the comments what you think about this, and see you in the next episodes on the Cremola channel.